Right, so it takes a special kind of government to look at hundreds of pensioners and priests being hauled off by riot police and decide the real problem is that they're still allowed to come back next week. But that's Keir Starmer's Britain for you now, apparently. A place where dissent is an administrative inconvenience, where the right to protest is treated like a parking permit now, and where empathy has been weaponised into a form of crowd control. Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, calls it balance. Her Home Office calls it public safety. Everyone else can see it for what it is, though, surely. Yet another Starmer-led authoritarian crackdown, all dressed up as moderation, weaponising a tragedy in Manchester to excuse all of it. Britain now has a Labour government expanding Tory laws to stop people saying the wrong thing too often, and doing it in the name of protecting those it will inevitably put in more danger in so doing. Well, who voted for that? Right, so yesterday the Metropolitan Police detained some 492 people at the latest pro-Palestine demonstration in London, organised under the Defend Our Juries campaign. 488 of those arrested were accused of supporting the prescribed organisation Palestine Action, of course. More grannies, more disabled people holding bits of cardboard, arrested in scenes that exemplify the damage being done to civil society and our right to protest. Arrests being made following months of protests and arrests, of the same people in some cases, all relating to Israel's assault on Gaza and Britain's ongoing role in arms exports to the Israeli military, their complicity. This demonstration was, as ever, largely peaceful, though. It included elderly campaigners, the clergy, students, legal observers, plenty of others. Among those arrested once more was Reverend Sue Parfitt, the 83-year-old retired Anglican priest who sat holding her banner supporting Palestine Action, as she claims to do. Police officers lifted her from her chair and placed her under arrest for it once more. When asked why a priest in her 80s was being detained, we were told that the law doesn't have an age limit. And so here we are now, the next day, of course, and Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood has announced that the government would be introducing additional powers now for police to control repeat protests, because God forbid people keep protesting about the same thing when nothing is actually changing. Senior officers, she said, would be authorised to consider the cumulative impact of previous demonstrations when deciding whether to impose conditions or relocate an event. She argued that such measures were necessary because repeated large-scale protests can leave sections of our country, particularly religious communities, feeling unsafe. She cited considerable fear within the Jewish community as justification for the change. Weaponizing religion to clamp down on our right to protest again. Weaponizing the incident in Manchester in not so many words that happened this week to clamp down on our right to protest. But the attack on a mosque in East Sussex on Saturday night barely warranting a mention beyond in comparison, though, of course. This announcement represents a decisive moment for civil liberties in the UK, therefore. It extends the protest restrictions introduced under the Conservatives and signals that this Labour in name-only government intends not just to retain, but now expand Tory powers first created under the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill of 2022 and, of course, the Public Order Act of 2023. Those laws criminalised disruption, broadened police discretion and made preemptive arrests easier. Labour has left those frameworks intact. The new measures follow the same trajectory that began under people like Preeti Patel and Suella Braverman, people that we all readily acknowledged were extremist, yet here we are with Starmer's Labour. People who pushed through successive pieces of legislation widening police authority. Their language was direct. Protesters were labelled mobs and eco-zealots. The difference under Labour is more stylistic, I would argue. Starmer and Mahmood frame similar policies as administrative balance, but the substance is completely unchanged. Under the previous acts, police could already impose conditions if a protest was considered seriously disruptive. What Mahmood now proposes is a cumulative test. Protests may be restricted or moved even if each individual event remains peaceful, simply because a pattern of regularity exists. How dare we keep protesting about something that the government refuses to engage with? How dare we inconvenience them? In effect, consistency has become a criterion for control now. Human rights organisations have long warned that these laws undermine the right of peaceful assembly that are protected by Article 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights, as we hear more of our politicians talking about pulling us out of that wholesale. Yet here you have an example of that being one such article being impinged upon. The cumulative impact, as Mahmood has called it, this clause of hers, takes that erosion further, introducing preemptive reasoning and lowering the threshold for interference. It also transfers significant discretion to senior officers without any transparent oversight. The result is the normalisation of state management of dissent. Protest, historically treated as a right of ours, is now being recategorised as an administrative issue that can be relocated or reduced to convenience. And the political context of Mahmood's announcement is also essential to this story, because it's what gave the government their opportunity here. 2 days before the London arrests, a gunman attacked a synagogue in Manchester, of course, as I've also covered in other videos, but which you will have seen on other news outlets as well. In the aftermath of that, though, news agencies began linking that tragedy directly to the upcoming London protests that happened this past weekend, implying a climate of tension between British Jews and pro-Palestine demonstrators. Starmer stated that protests should respect the grief of British Jews. So this framing blurred the distinction between a criminal act of terror and a peaceful political expression in two events that are actually completely separate issues and totally distinct from each other, to weaponise one in order to clamp down on the other. The government's use of this linkage, it marks a shift from policing actions to policing emotions, doesn't it? The justification for limiting protest is not a matter of public safety anymore in the practical sense. It's about emotional comfort for people who might be distressed by it. And this sets a dangerous precedent because it defines rights not by legality, but by perceived sensitivity. They would rather strip people's rights away than stop supporting Israel's genocide and stop weaponising Judaism in order to do that. It also places Jewish citizens in an impossible position, frankly. Their legitimate concerns are being used to curtail other people's freedoms, creating the impression of collective responsibility, that they are somehow responsible for what Israel is also doing. Jewish Voice for Liberation, formerly called Jewish Voice for Labour, but they don't want to be associated with Starmer's gang anymore, and who can possibly blame them, an organisation representing Jewish members of society, criticised this approach. In its statement, Labour's Defence of Authoritarianism, a Danger to Us All, that was published last year, it argued then that invoking Jewish safety to rationalise restrictions endangers Jewish people by reinforcing anti-Semitic tropes. And yet here we go again with this expansion of police powers. Many Jewish campaigners have continued to join pro-Palestine marches themselves, rejecting the idea that security can be achieved through suppression. By reducing complex social realities to a single narrative of fear, the government risks inflaming tensions rather than easing them, therefore. And the optics of appointing a Muslim Home Secretary to front this policy has been politically very useful for Labour. Mahmood's involvement allows the government to present the crackdown as balanced rather than biased. Yet her statements have already been used by sections of the press to frame the issue as an intra-communal dispute between Muslims and Jews. This plays directly into the culture war narratives that have dominated British media for far too long already. The government's claim that it is acting for community safety conceals the fact that the measures are aimed overwhelmingly at movements that include a high proportion of British Muslims. It also risks fueling Islamophobia by reinforcing associations between Muslim identity, protest, and public disorder. The same framing that purports to protect Jews could therefore result in greater hostility towards Muslims, as right-wing media outlets use Labour's policy to legitimise long-standing stereotypes about extremism and public threat, especially given the conflation with the incident in Manchester. But compare all of this to the situations now being seen across southern Europe right now. Italy, Spain, Portugal have seen large demonstrations against Israel's conduct in Gaza, especially in light of the seizure of the Global Summit flotilla and nearly 500 people on board those vessels, and their own government's complicity in that, especially when it comes to Italy and Spain, actually, who sent warships to the flotilla, who then did absolutely nothing as Israel struck. In Italy, unions called a general strike across more than 100 cities. In Rome, organisers claimed around 1 million participants. Spain witnessed similar marches in Madrid and Barcelona, and Portugal's capital, Lisbon, saw its largest protest on foreign policy in years. Despite Italy being governed by Giorgia Meloni, whose far-right party is rooted in post-war neo-fascism, these demonstrations were permitted to proceed anyway. Italy's constitution, shaped by its experience of fascism during World War II, and obviously having come out of that, explicitly protects the right to assembly. The same is true of Spain and Portugal, actually, both of which emerged from dictatorships as well, with constitutional safeguards built in against that repression ever being able to happen again. But Britain, by contrast, has no codified constitution at all. And we're in real trouble now because of it. Because the politicians, once seen as too honourable for such a thing to be needed, the very reason why we don't have a constitution, very much no longer are. Parliament's sovereignty allows any government with a majority to rewrite the rules governing public expression. The comparison underlines how far the United Kingdom has diverged from European norms. Where continental states with authoritarian histories now defend the principle of protest, Britain's restricting it. Under existing legislation, police could impose conditions on a protest if it created an immediate obstruction, excessive noise, or danger. The new cumulative impact test changes the logic of enforcement. It allows police to act on the basis of prior experience rather than present conduct. And this effectively institutionalizes collective liability. One group's actions can justify restrictions on another's future activity. So in practice, this approach is an attempt to deter continuous campaigning. Environmental groups, trade unions, anti-racist organisations rely on repetition to maintain momentum. The new powers will make long-term mobilisation more difficult, if not impossible. Affiliated trade unions should be threatening Labour with disaffiliation with immediate effect over this. Employers and universities will face pressure to distance themselves from organisers. But actually, this has already been happening. This transformation's already begun. Police data shows a significant rise in preemptive interventions and arrests under the Public Order Act since it was introduced in 2023. The cumulative impact principle will expand that capacity further, giving law enforcement new grounds to refuse permission or redirect events. The chilling effect on public participation should be obvious to everyone, regardless of what your political leanings are. Central justification for these powers, which is protecting the public from intimidation, simply does not hold up under scrutiny. The government has presented anecdotal claims of fear within communities, but no empirical evidence of widespread harm resulting from pro-Palestine demonstrations. Zionists have basically wailed about all of this, and Starmer and co have jumped to their tune. And if you don't think Israel has anything to do with this, and restrictions on protesting in the same place, now, as I've said already, euphemistically being called cumulative disruption, ask yourself why this is happening now after Palestine protests, and not in the wake of literal fascists camping outside of that hotel in Epping day after day, getting their rocks off terrorising asylum seekers. Starmer somehow always ends up legitimising the far right as he jumps to the Israel lobby's tune. The reality is that the government's actions protect political authority rather than public safety. Protests have become a visible embarrassment for a leadership that has sought to maintain alignment with Israel while managing domestic discontent. By restricting demonstrations, Labour tries to shield itself from sustained moral and media pressure. The protests have got Starmer rattled, basically. He hates that, and he's lashing out. So the decision to pursue additional restrictions reflects a political strategy rather than a security necessity. Starmer's leadership is defined by a desire to appear stable and conservative on matters of law and order. The calculation is that demonstrating toughness towards protesters neutralises attacks from the right-wing press, who he likes to kiss up to, and reassures the business and security establishment. But this approach carries serious reputational risks. Civil liberties lawyers, human rights groups, and a number of Labour MPs have already described the policy as disproportionate and counterproductive. Liberty called it an unlawful assault on the right to protest. Former senior judges have apparently questioned whether it's even compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. Trade unions and grassroots organisations need to begin coordinating some legal challenges here. The backlash highlights the limits of Starmer's strategy as well. What was intended to project authority is instead reinforcing a already baked-in perception of authoritarian drift on his part. Internationally, Britain's image as a defender of democratic norms is deteriorating, so much for the mother of all parliaments, eh? Both Jewish and Muslim communities are likely to be harmed by this policy, not protected by it. The only ones who will be pleased are going to be the Zionists. Jewish citizens who oppose Israeli actions will find themselves implicated in government decisions that they do not even support. Pro-Palestine Jews have expressed concern that being portrayed as beneficiaries of repression will fuel anti-Semitic resentment against them, which are surely going to drive more incidents like Manchester, and not fewer. For Muslims, the consequences are immediate: increased police scrutiny and media hostility risk, deepening social division. The presence of a Muslim Home Secretary does not offset this effect. It may even intensify it by allowing the government to deny discrimination while enforcing policies that disproportionately affect Muslims. And of course, Mahmood herself, once upon a time, very much believed in protest, it would seem. Well, I wonder what happened there. Selling out to climb the greasy pole of power, perhaps? She should learn the lessons of Angela Rayner, I dare say. But the result is a policy that undermines intercommunal trust and strengthens far-right narratives of conflict between minorities. The British mainstream media has, of course, played a central role in shaping public perceptions on such matters. Right-wing outlets such as the Daily Mail, the Times, and major broadcasters have consistently framed protests as disruptive rather than democratic. By linking demonstrations to terrorism or community tension, they create a moral justification for stronger policing rather than the visible exercising of our right to freedom of expression and right to protest. And this feedback loop benefits both the government and the press. Ministers can point to media coverage to defend their actions. Editors gain audience engagement from stories of confrontation. The effect is to narrow the boundaries of acceptable dissent. It takes little effort to expose the shameless opportunism on show, though, when you consider 13 Britons are currently held by Israel, having been taking part in the summit flotilla, but there's been no mention, let alone condemnation of that, because of course that's Israel. But when various outlets chose to place the Manchester attack and the London arrest within the same narrative frame, it illustrates how easily context can be manipulated by them. The emotional impact of violence is used to delegitimise peaceful opposition, despite the two events having no connection with each other at all. Britain's constitutional framework lacks the safeguards found in other democracies. Parliamentary sovereignty allows the executive to pass far-reaching laws with minimal judicial oversight. The courts, citing deference to Parliament, rarely intervene, and this has created a feedback mechanism where each expansion of policing power sets a new baseline for the next. The cumulative impact principle exemplifies this trend. It is legally vague, open to interpretation, and difficult to challenge in court. Once implemented, it will likely become standard practice for managing dissent. The absence of codified rights means that the burden of proof rests on citizens rather than the state. This incremental process explains why the United Kingdom, despite its democratic traditions, now ranks lower than several European states on measures of civic freedom. The irony is that countries with authoritarian pasts have built stronger democratic defences than Britain has, which never experienced occupational regime change. The erosion now visible in London is therefore self-inflicted, and the massive amount of apathy in the country has given space for it to happen. The long-term consequence of these measures is an erosion of trust between citizens and institutions. When law enforcement becomes an instrument of political messaging, it loses public confidence. When protest is treated as disruption, citizens disengage from formal politics altogether. And the government's insistence that the measures balance rights disguises their real effect. They shift power further towards the executive and away from civic society. The state's growing inability to determine when and how people may express opposition is incompatible with a functioning democracy. Domestically, the backlash is growing as it must, though. The Labour backbenchers have warned that the crackdown could alienate younger voters and civil society allies. Rights groups are preparing coordinated legal actions. Campaign networks are linking the issue to wider questions about surveillance and political policing. As for the political pushback on it, the Greens have thus far been the only ones I've seen to attack this right out of the gate. Zach Polansky hit the nail on the head when he called it out, saying, "This is grim and dangerous overreach. This is a government that have lost the moral argument and are still selling arms to Israel, now further cracking down on dissent. Absolutely the opposite of what they should be doing. So, of course, this is what the Labour government choose." The strategy designed to protect Starmer's authority now threatens to define his premiership as repressive and short-sighted. The expansion of protest restrictions under Keir Starmer's government represents the most serious challenge to civil liberties in the UK in a generation. It extends the authoritarian framework created by previous Conservative administrations and embeds it within politics of moderation. By justifying repression through the language of safety and community fear, the government risks inflaming the very tensions it claims to want to reduce. The policy undermines Jewish and Muslim communities alike, damages Britain's international reputation, and weakens public trust in democratic institutions. The principle at stake is very straightforward, people. The right to peaceful protest is a cornerstone of any democratic society. Once eroded, it's rarely restored. So the question now confronting Britain is whether a government elected to end conservative authoritarianism intends instead to entrench it. Well, the outcome of the coming months, with the inevitable legal challenges that must come, the parliamentary debates, the public response, will determine whether protest in Britain remains a right or ends up becoming a regulated privilege. But the power for that actually is in all of our hands. For more on the latest on the Manchester attack and the actual events and what transpired there, please do check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, of course, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.